All right, what is up, guys? All right, we're going to try this again. It's going to be a little bit different here today in the way that we do it. Obviously, we're going to be watching this in class. I've already told you guys if you're not here today, we're kind of going to be stopping this during class as we go through and do some things, but you'll still have the ability to kind of stay with us with what we're doing. So let's talk about our segue here into the modern campaign. So campaigning has changed over time. It's changed quite a bit, and there's a lot of reasons why. Okay, we've evolved. We've evolved with technology. We've evolved with laws, and just the way money in politics. There's just a lot of things that have offered changes. Okay, to the modern campaign and what it looks like. So today, what we want to take a look at here first is hopefully this will allow me to. There we go. Um, it says changes in recent decades characterize modern campaigns and how their organization strategies affect elections. So we want to look at these four areas and a few more as we go through today. So longer election cycles. All right, we'll take a look at that here first. I talked about that idea of like when we announce. That's kind of the preview of what we're going to be looking at there. Increased campaign cost and fundraising efforts. All right, how much it costs and how much you're going to need to even run a campaign. We're talking about at the national level. We know it's a little easier local. You don't need to put millions and millions of dollars in, but you're talking about running for president. It's getting beyond millions at this point in time in terms of what it's approaching. Pretty insane in terms of the amount of money that's in there. And I'll give you some numbers here in a little bit. All right. Increased reliance on professional consultants. All right. So they've turned to the outside. We'll talk about that, like this idea of outsiders. We've even turned to some of them. They might be consultants for a party in particular, okay? And while others have used those that just had success in the past and have jumped from campaign to campaign depending on what they're doing here. And then the role of social media in both communication and fundraising. All right. So the idea of getting your name out there, it's a lot easier to donate to a PAC, a super PAC, a campaign directly, a party, just by going on the internet, putting your $5 donation. Obviously, you can do more, but it's really changed, and it's changed fundamentally how we run the modern day campaign. All right, so let's get into this first part here. Longer election cycles. What are we talking about here? So, candidates will announce their candidacy almost 2 to 3 years before the election. And we've only seen this widen this gap. All right. So let's go back to this. The first Iowa caucus was February 3rd of 2020. The election was in November. So you think about just that process from the moment that the primary starts until the election being in November. All right. You're talking about almost year. Now, that's just in that process. How long? So think of that. Almost 25%, if for a president, right? 25% of their term is almost tied up in just that part of the campaign. All right. But if you go to the idea of how this has changed, so Trump filed for reelection, okay, the day he was sworn in. So the day he is sworn in, he files for reelection. He held a political rally, and then you kind of look at it historically like a reelection rally a month after. So the idea of campaigning from the day being elected until the day of the next election. So just the time that is spent is kind of insane where that's at. Now think about that. We always talk about just in terms of productivity, balancing, campaigning, everything's up for reelection. Hopefully what you do would be enough to get you elected. All right. But this, how long this is and how long this is drawn out is pretty insane. Um, It says before the 1970s, presidential candidates were chosen by party leaders, sometimes in secret, and the election process was usually much shorter. Okay, this is the party bosses. That idea we've touched on that, the amount of power that they had. All right, these party leaders really making the choice, and this was the delegate process. Before this will be touched on another slide, but it was really they had all the power. And this is before they changed and put the power into more of the voters and the people to choose their candidates. Okay. As we see, hopefully that in turn turns into in the actual election between, let's say, in the two-party system of Republican versus Democrat, getting better results for their party members. But they really take away that party from the party leaders. All right. It says primaries and caucuses were relatively unimportant, being advisory only. Okay, party leaders, they could really ignore what the people had to say with that idea of the delegates and who held those delegate seats, and they could choose a different candidate. In a lot of states before this, they didn't even hold a vote. All right, so they go through the primary. It's kind of like I said, it was an advisory session as opposed to a for sure vote. That has changed quite a bit now. Since the 76 election, both Republicans and Democrats have used state primaries as the principal way of selecting presidential candidates. All right. This is the way we know of. This is the way we've discussed. And this has changed the campaigning process. And it's lengthened the campaign process. So you first got to compete in your party, and then you got to go compete in the regular election. All right. And that's where you'll see the messaging really differs. Right. So you might go, your most extreme the extreme part of your platform is typically plays out in that primary, and then you got to come back to the middle in the general election, as you got to kind of cater to the middle, as that's going to be a big part of your vote. But the middle doesn't vote as much in the primaries and the caucuses, so your messaging changes. All right. Excuse me. An unintended consequence of the increased importance of state level votes is that the presidential election cycle has become longer. All right, that's what I just said. um, 3 years to 4 years ahead of the election day. And the idea of what's the chance of this individual, that happens 4, sometimes 5 years. The names gets thrown out there to see how people respond, and that can differ and change as you go through. Advertising can go on for a year and a half, for example, with millions of dollars being associated with this. Um, and the U.S. system, I mean, that's what it does. And we'll talk about this in the coming slide. It requires a candidate to raise millions of dollars to even really mount a serious run. All right. We compare this to other nations. You see here, national election campaign length in days. There's nothing really even close to what the United States does. All right, and how long our process is. So, all right, cost and consultants. We want to talk about how campaign costs has risen significantly. All right, we're talking big time numbers. Um, and where does the money come from? So it could be individual donors as well as corporations and as well as the parties themselves. So let's just take a look at some numbers here. So in 92, if you take the campaigns of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot, they spent $192 million, which, if you adjust that for inflation, it's around $300 million. In the closest race in modern history, Bush and Gore, all right, who gets caught up in the controversy in Florida, spent more than $200 million. All right. In 2004, George W. Bush spent $345 million, which was the most expensive campaign in history. All right. Which doesn't last that long. In '08, okay, the total money spent by Obama, all right, was at $730 million, surpassing Republican nominee John McCain, who spent $333 million himself. All right. And if you talk about, look what we started. We started in 92, okay, with Herbert Walker Bush and Clinton and Perot spending what is modern day about $300 million adjusted for inflation, or 192 at the time. Insane how much it's grown. All right. So let's jump into, that was '08. Where are we at now? Okay. Even more modern day. 2012, Obama spends $775 million to win his reelection. All right. That's the Obama campaign. An additional $285 million comes in with political action committees, PACs. All right. Making the total at around $985 million. All right. Romney, who runs against him in the losing effort, spends $460 million. 378 comes in from the RNC, the Republican Party, okay? And then another 153 million from PACs, okay? So 992 million. It doesn't stop there. Let's keep going with this, all right? Presidential election in 2016. They estimated that this was going to be like about $3 billion put in this election. It doesn't come in that high, but it's relatively high, all right? at about $2.4 billion being spent. Clinton's campaign spends a total of $768 million. All right. Trump spends $400 million. Okay. Um, and then a lot of money comes in through PACs and other things where this comes away. And it's just insane the amount of money that is in these campaigns. So, like I said, so where's the money coming from? Let's go back. So I just threw a bunch of numbers at you. All right. Just to show you the rise of this. So first off, you have an increased cycle. So the cycle of the campaign, right? In the wake of longer cycles, as my mouse is kind of floating around here, let me get the pen. All right. In the wake of longer cycles and increased cost. All right. So the longer the cycle, the more money can be thrown in. And it means that you are campaigning for a longer amount of time. If I'm only campaigning for 6 months, I don't have to spend as much money. If I'm campaigning for 3.5 years, 4 years, 2 years, whatever it may be, I'm campaigning. I got to pour a lot of money into this. All right. So it's an increased cost. So you can't really sit at the table and be serious about a candidacy without some money. Why is that? That it matters. It's going to be really hard to run a campaign from a YouTube page. All right. There's multiple ways. You got to get yourself, you got to be taken seriously. You've got to be able to invited to debates. There's individuals who weren't able to go to debates and it totally screwed up their candidacy. All right. And a big part of this too is now these individuals are bringing in, okay, these consultants. They bring in these consultants and what do? They help them kind of in this process. And you can't think of a modern, really presidential and candidates for the House and the Senate also who don't use these consultants. There's degrees to these and how much they're going to cost and how much you have to pay them. All right. But they have large responsibility for the campaign. They're going to manage the campaign. They're going to make sure that they're getting good numbers. They're conducting polls. What should the messaging be? Where should we go? All right. They got to craft the messaging not only for the media, but for the public. And this is going to go through ads. This is going to go through social media. We got to use every avenue that we can because where are we going to hit our demographic of 18 to 24? How are we going to reach them? Okay. How are we going to reach the middle age? How are we going to reach seniors? And what should we say to each? So if we're putting it out on Twitter, we're putting it out on Facebook, if we're putting it out through mailings in a more door-to-door grassroots type way, who's going to read that and what is the messaging for that? Okay. And a lot of these consultants, they have their ear to the ground in campaigning and understand what this takes. All right. And you add all of this together, it's a costly, long process. Okay. Let's go. The impact of social media. It's 21st century, right? Social media has become a huge, important medium for communicating campaign goals, mobilizing voters, and fundraising. Okay. It's amazing, as I brought this up in the past and several times throughout this semester, is I can, as a candidate, I can talk to my voters tonight. I can talk to them tomorrow morning, depending on what avenue I use for social media. All right. I can mobilize voters. All right. I can find ways to get them out to polls. I can use individuals who can help get individuals to polls. All right. And find ways to reach them. The impact of social media has played a large role in the campaigning process. Purchasing social media data enables the campaigns to micro-target voters. We know what this idea is. How do we figure this out? All right. We use the data that is out there and is accessible to them. All right. So that we can design our messages. Okay. We need to persuade. We need to engage voters. All right. Based off of their online behaviors and what are their interests and what will motivate them. Okay. Now, one of the last things we want to look at when it comes to the modern day campaign, that's party versus candidate. All right. So what's the role of the party versus the candidate? We talk about it's candidate centered politics these days. All right. These candidates are rock stars as opposed to being leaders of a party. They're rock stars within themselves. They're outsiders. Okay. In the way that they kind of function. We might not view him as a rock star, relax, it's a politician, but you don't understand the idea. It's more about that individual as opposed to a party platform sometimes. So the parties have lost some influence. How? First off, think about what I said earlier, the idea of the influence of we're going to choose the candidate. That's why it's more candidate centered. When you've put the power back more to the people, which people will say this is a good thing as opposed to a party boss and their influence, okay, it gives the voters more choice, and the way that that appeal of that individual becomes really important. The coalitions within parties have realigned. So the idea of the groups within and where they've gone, you've got within parties, you've got many different facets within or coalitions. Endorsements from politicians are less impactful as people search for outsiders. Okay, so I might, you know, President A might endorse me, okay, but sometimes I don't even want that endorsement. All right, like it's like depending on my district, my state, that endorsement from you might not be as popular, okay? And they're not as impactful because people are looking for these outsiders. I don't want you. I want you removed from Washington, right? Like, what was the appeal of Trump for a lot of people, right? It was this idea of him as an outsider, okay? Um, these individuals do how much experience do we want? Do we want somebody that's been tied up into Washington for 30 years? Some would say yes, I want that experience. Some say no, I want somebody who's not played and been a part of this game throughout this time. Party money is less critical to the campaign. There's just a lot more outside money because the laws have allowed it. All right, that's coming up in with the three remaining lessons that we have. Just the access. You didn't have as much access to outside money before. Now that you do, it's just really lost the effect of what the party comes in with. The parties come in with a lot of money. I gave you some numbers there, but not nearly as much as they can raise on their own through the campaign. But here's where parties are still really important. Okay, they have the most data available to them. All right, voter data. All right, they have ways to access this, and this is the consultants play a role with this and accessing this somewhat too. But the parties kind of run this one and can get this to all of their candidates as they go through that process. They have the most institutional knowledge, right? It's experience. There's a lot of experience within the party. All right, the inner workings of right organizing within. There's still a lot of power as you try to think of how votes run along party lines. So there's obviously a lot of power there still in that knowledge that they have and the power that they still hold. And they're obviously going to coordinate the policy agenda. Okay, we talked about this: Democrat in name only, Republican in name only, because there is an agenda by each party. And when you sway too far from it, you can lose some appeal. You might gain the appeal of some, or you, as a really popular candidate, could fundamentally change what the party looks like a little bit. Um, they have access to volunteers and organizers, which is obviously really important in campaigning. Uh, Reserve info on elites and party donors. They just through history and through that many heads, they have a lot more of connections. And then influence the electoral process and nomination contest. So there is still a lot of influence that is held by the party when looking